That was the first 15 minutes of the Smitson film. We'll watch the last 15 minutes just before the end of my talk. That way you'll know, given the word interminable in my title, that it's nearly ended. But I wanted to show you some of the film straight and then come back to it after some of the discussion at the end. I'd like to begin with a quotation from Smitson from an essay that he wrote in 1967. This is the accompanying sketch entitled Some Void Thoughts on Museums. And it reads as follows. Museums are tombs, and it looks like everything is turning into a museum. Painting, sculpture, and architecture are finished. But the art habit continues. Art settles into a stupendous inertia. This is a characteristic prophetic kind of discourse from Smitson. It is perhaps the greatest of many of the ironies that pervade the reception of Smithson's work over the last 35 years, since his death in 1973. That until quite recently, Smithson's work has been received primarily within the terms of a debate about the meaning and possibilities of sculpture. This is a word which I will use throughout this talk in inverted commas, in what we call scare quotes, as a kind of a sort of sarcasm. I think it's hard to say the word sculpture without a certain sarcasm. And part of what I want to talk about Smitson is about the disjunction between that fact, which is in many ways the product of work like Smithson's, and the fact that it continues to be discussed using this word sculpture. That's one of the things I'm going to talk about. In the words of Robert Hobbs, who was the first and foremost, and in certain but limited respects, one of the best critical interpreters of Smithson's work in the first decade following his death, that's to say 73 to 83. He was also the organiser of the first major retrospective of Smithson's work at Cornell University in 1980, symptomatically entitled Robert Smithson, Sculpture. That's the book that accompanied the exhibition. Smithson's, this is the quotation from Hobbes, Smithson's major contribution as an artist was to enlarge the realm of sculptural space. At a time at which in the United States, art was decisively changed when sculpture reasserted itself as a primary framework for re-evaluating humanity's relationship to the world. He's talking about the 1960s, right? And obviously he's talking about what is more commonly described as minimalism. This quotation is taken from the conclusion to an essay of Hobbes that he wrote for the catalogue of a subsequent retrospective of Smithson's 2 years later, which was shown in the United States Pavilion at the 40th Venice Biennale, which is in a way the high point of the early institutional recognition of Smithson, and which then went on to tour quite a few European venues. And in fact, in the 80s and 90s, Smithson's work was shown much more widely in Europe than it was in America. The Smithson revival of the late 1990s, to which I'll come back to later, was fostered by young artists, primarily American, but European as well, rather than by curators or critics. It's an important point, I think. It really only achieved any institutional form belatedly in the last 5 years, notably in the large retrospective in 2004-05 that began in Los Angeles and ended up in the Whitney. There's also been, more recently, a couple of academic monographs on Smithson, books like Anne Reynolds' Smithson Learning from New Jersey and Elsewhere, and Jennifer Roberts' Mirror Travels, Smithson and History. So there's a sort of belated academicization the reception of Smitson, but it's taken an extremely long time, and it's come on the back of this interest in young artists. Now, as the cover to Hobbes's book indicates, spiral jetty is taken to be emblematic within this discourse of the enlargement of the realm of sculptural space, which is Smithson's great achievement. As are in the European context, his works actually here in the Netherlands, in Emmen, from the following year, 1971, you're probably familiar with these, Broken Circle and Spiral Hill, which interestingly formed the cover of the catalogue for the Venice show. I didn't have a copy of the Venice one. This is the Duisburg edition. They just kept reprinting different museums' names on the front as it went around Europe. Interestingly, there were plans. Smitson was planning to make a film to go with this work, to go with the Dutch work, in the same way that he made the film of Spiral Jetty, but for various practical reasons that never happened. As a consequence, this work, like Spiral Jetty, although with Spiral Jetty there is the film, still tends to be reinforced, to have a kind of sculptural reception. In a way, it's a pity there's not a film, but the film Spiral Jetty hasn't really had any effect on countering this sculptural reception. Now, claims about Smitson similar to Hobbes's can be found, for example, in the writings of the foremost American theorist of sculpture in the 70s, which would have to be Rosalind Krauss, at least prior to her semiotic term in 77, when she left her job as associate editor of Art Forum and went to found October. In the brief introduction that Krauss gives to her book Passages in Modern Sculpture from 77, which is the kind of hinge, really, that sums up her 5 years at Art Forum. This brief introduction contains two images that delimit the scope of the argument of the book, which is the Passages in Modern Sculpture. The first image, familiarly, is the anonymous 1st century BC sculpture of Legu and his sons from the Vatican, which was the topic of Lessing's famous 18th century treatise on aesthetics, which was, of course, the main source for Clement Greenberg's formalist aesthetics, which Krauss was at the time when she was at Art Forum attempting to extend in relation to new works. Was trying to, in some sense, save formalist modernism from Greenberg's grumpy growing old. The second image, with apologies for the quality of the image, is Spiral Jetty. These are the bookends of this book. As a new critical history of modern sculpture, Krauss's book begins with a chapter on Rodin's Gates of Hell, but it ends with a discussion of a variety of work from just a few years prior to its publication, famously grouped together under the idea of a new syntax for sculpture. Pride of place is given there to 4 works. At the very end of the book, there's 4 works which represent, if you like, contemporary sculpture. They're Bruce Naumann's Corridor from 68, Robert Morris's Labyrinth from 74, Richard Serra's Shift, and last, and given pride of place once again, is Spiral Jetty, with a copy of the book in which they haven't quite managed to print the pages in line. Krauss concludes the book across these 2 pages as follows. With these images in passage, he's referring to those 4 works. The transformation of sculpture from a static, idealized medium to a temporal and material one that had begun with Rodin is finally achieved. Okay, so with these images, the transformation of sculpture that began in 1880 with Rodin is finally achieved. This is, if you like, Krauss's early critical claim for Smitson, and specifically for Spiral Jetty as, in some sense, the high point of his achievement in that respect. It's a major critical claim, yet, of course, it flies in the face of Smithson's explicit rejection of the medium-specific modernist formalism that Krauss was developing here with respect to the 3-dimensional work of the 60s and 70s. As the quotation at the beginning